Good morning. This is session 6 out of 6 on the Corinthian Letters. And we have been using the partition theory of Robert Jewett and myself. And so we are just about finished with Corinthians. We will today look at the letter of reconciliation, letter G, which is 2 Corinthians 1:1 through 2:13 plus 7:5 through 16. And then letter H is a letter fragment, and 2 Corinthians 9:1 through 15. It's simply a letter fragment, and it was put into this pastiche of letters called 2 Corinthians because it was next to 2 Corinthians 8, which is a letter also asking for money for the relief of the Jerusalem church. But chapter 8 and chapter 9 are different from each other. They reflect different situations. And actually, chapter 9 may not be to the Corinthian church at all. It may be to the churches of Achaia. In other words, Corinth is the capital of Achaia, more or less. But there maybe were other churches nearby in the province of Achaia, and they may be a little bit more generous with their money than the nouveau riche Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians 9 reflects a bit of a shift from the situation reflected in 2 Corinthians 8. But both chapters 8 and 9 are fundraising letter fragments. Letter G is the letter of consolation, and we call it the letter of consolation because this letter uses the topics of consolation. What were they, you may ask? Well, consolation was very well known in Greek literature, and especially Hellenistic Greek literature. Basically, it was sort of like a Hallmark card in a way. Namely, one of the ways of doing consolation, in other words, you write to somebody who has suffered a grave loss, a death in the family, or some terrible thing has happened. And basically, one of the major things that you do is say, okay, you've suffered, but by the way, I've suffered too. And therefore, since both of us have suffered, then we can kind of commiserate with each other. So you've suffered, I've suffered too. And so this letter is also called the letter of reconciliation because it seems to reflect Paul's desire to cement the reconciliation in place between himself and the Corinthian church. Before letter F, the Corinthian church threw Paul out, or basically said, you're no longer our apostle anymore. And that was before letter F, and then he wrote the slashing attack, as my teacher called it. And so letter F, 2 Corinthians 10, 11, 12, and 13, plus a little bit of 1 Corinthians 9. And that seems to have done the trick, as we will see in chapter 2 and 5. So it's all about reconciliation, and the reconciliation begins with the topics of consolation that we see in chapter 1 of letter G. Letter G, as we call it on our partition theory, presupposes that Paul has in fact sent, and the Corinthians have received, the letter of tears that he refers to in 2 Corinthians 2:4. I wrote you out of much anguish of heart and with many tears. Now, he didn't mention there, well, you know, I really wanted to beat the hell out of you. But that's what the letter of tears was about. If the letter of tears mentioned in 2:4 is the same as 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. If the letter of tears mentioned in 2 Corinthians 2:4 is not 2 Corinthians 10, 11, 12, and 13, then the letter of tears is lost. You can hang your hat on that. If it is not 10 through 13, if that is not the severe letter that Paul says, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, I wrote you out of much anguish of heart and with many tears, if that letter mentioned in 2:4 is not 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, then you can be morally certain that the letter of tears is lost. So we have to try to piece together the history after having pieced together the letters. And so the reconstruction of the letters goes hand in hand with the reconstruction of what happened that caused Paul to write the letters. Yes?
Can I ask a question? This letter of tears, I see that it's mentioned in the Bible, but it's not like in the Bible as the letter of tears.
We think that it's embedded in 2 Corinthians 10,
okay.
10 through 13.
Okay.
Because remember in 1 Corinthians 5:9, he says, I wrote you not to associate with immoral people.
It is, but it isn't. But
it's not a
labeled.
separate letter
Okay.
in the canonical form of the New Testament that we
it's
have.
It's not labeled, this is the letter of tears.
No. It's labeled, these letters are labeled from Paul, pros Corinthius, to the Corinthians, pros Romaius. And we don't know what they would have been called in the first century, because we do not have a first century text of these letters. We are presupposing the correctness of a partition theory. People who don't like our partition theory or any partition theory, they are presupposing a unity theory. Both a unity theory and a partition theory, they are both theoretical. We don't know for sure, and so we have to basically say, here's the evidence in favor of it. And the people who don't believe in a partition theory can cite their evidence, if there is any, and I don't think there is, in favor of a unity theory. And so for most critical New Testament scholars, most people believe that 2 Corinthians is a collection, an edited collection. And in our book, The Corinthian Correspondence, Jewett and myself, we have argued that 1 Corinthians is also a heavily edited collection, which makes the Corinthian letters different from Romans, makes them different from 1 Thessalonians, and makes it different from Galatians. Because those letters they are very continuous letters, and they flow very, very well from start to finish. It's the Corinthian letters that have these extremely rough transitions. And if you want to read about the rough transitions, read all about it in chapters 3 and 4 of our book. That was one of the things that Bob did while he was in Minden, is he said, maybe we need to just make a list of all the rough transitions in 1 Corinthians. And I said we should, and he did. And so that is what that chapter 4 is about, is he goes through each of the rough transitions in 1 Corinthians. You don't have to make a big case that 2 Corinthians is a bunch of letters edited together. We have tried to make the case that 1 Corinthians is a collection of letters. And our readers, our other scholars and other readers will have to decide whether that is likely or not. Remember, in a criminal trial in the United States, the prosecution has to try to prove that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, or in Barbados, beyond a shadow of a doubt. We cannot do that with first century literature. So we do not have the bar of beyond reasonable doubt or beyond any doubt. Our bar is, what does the preponderance of the evidence show? So it's a lower bar than some people would agree to. Okay, well, let's take a look at letter G. It's a deliberative letter, and therefore it uses the topics of honor and advantage. You'll remember that speeches have conventional parts of the speech. And I've given you the Greek terms I've given you the Latin terms on the left and the Greek terms transliterated on the right. And so the last one is the epilogos in Greek, and in Latin it's the peroratio. And in that, you recapitulate the arguments of the proof, the probatio, and you also raise the emotions. At the very beginning, you have the introduction of the speaker to the audience, and then you often have a narration, and then you have the proof. And then before the proof, you sometimes have a partitio where he says, okay, I'm going to talk about this and this and this and this. And then in the proof, he talks about those things frequently in a different order. In deliberative rhetoric, as we know from the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum, written by pseudo-Aristotle, we know that in deliberative rhetoric, you don't have to have a separate piece of narration before the proof. You can have a little bit of proof, you can have a little narration in between the parts of the proof. And so we know about that from the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum, which is by pseudo-Cicero. And so it's called the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum because it's by pseudo-Aristotle, and Aristotle was the teacher of a very famous person, Alexander the Great. And so in the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum, it's not really by Aristotle. There's more about deliberative rhetoric, this genus of rhetoric, than in any other handbook of rhetoric. But using that pattern, you have the exordium in the first 11 verses, and then you have a partitio where he says, okay, the first subject is that my boast is that in the past I have acted blamelessly. Now, a lot of Corinthians might disagree with that one. And the second is that Paul's teaching in his letters is clear and understandable. And that may have been against the idea that no one can really understand Paul's letters. You'll remember that in 2 Corinthians 10:10, Paul cites the charge against him. His letters are weighty and strong. In other words, they're persuasive. But his oral rhetoric is no good. His ability to speak publicly really stinks. And so Paul argues in the second subject regarding the present that his letters, like the letters to the Corinthians, which have been misunderstood in the past or not followed in the past, that his letters are actually clear and understandable. And then concerning the future, he says that Paul should be able to boast about the Corinthians, and the Corinthians should be able in the future to boast about Paul. Okay? In other words, he's sort of identifying with the Corinthians in a way, and that sort of reminds you of consolation literature. And then, if you look on at the argumentation, there's a little piece of narratio in 1:15 and 16, where he narrates his past conduct. And then part of the critique against Paul was that he had to change his travel plans, and that meant he was indecisive, right? He was saying yes and no. And then he has more narration about his change of travel plans. And then part of the thing in 2:5 and following is that there should be forgiveness for the offending brother. The offending brother was probably a ringleader of the opposition to Paul, just like in a parish. Okay, and then there's more narration about Paul's travel to Troas and Macedonia. And then in chapter 7, verse 8 and following, there's an explanation of what happened when they got the letter of tears. How about that? So let me read this. I'm starting at 1:3 of 2 Corinthians. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all consolation, who consoles us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to console those who are in any affliction with the consolation with which we ourselves are consoled by God. Any doubts about what this letter is about? Consolation, see? For just as the sufferings of Christ are abundant for us, so also our consolation is abundant through Christ. If we are being afflicted, it is for your consolation and salvation. If we are being consoled, it is for your consolation, which you experience when you patiently endure the same sufferings that we also are suffering. Note the mutuality of suffering, a big topic in consolation. Our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, so also you share in our means Paul's, consolation. And then, let me go back here. Then he goes on to talk about his troubles in Asia, meaning Asia Minor. 1:8. We do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, of the affliction that we experience in Asia. Asia is the Roman province of Asia, meaning Asia Minor, like Ephesus and Corinth and Colossae. We were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death so that we would rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He who rescued us from so deadly a peril will continue to rescue us. On him we have set our hope. And then let's go on. In the partitio begins in 1:12. And so here is where the subjects of the proof are listed briefly. Indeed, this is our boast, the testimony of our conscience. Our conscience means Paul's conscience. We have behaved in the world with frankness and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and all the more towards you. I've done everything right with respect to the Corinthian congregation, even though you threw me out as your apostle, and I had to write you a really tough letter, okay? And he's going to tell you about the tough letter, okay? Verse 13, for we write you nothing other than what you can read and also understand, and I hope you will understand until the end, etc. And I hope you will understand, as we have already understood, that on the day of the Lord Jesus, in the day of judgment, we are your boast, even as you are our boast. Paul is going to be able to say, hey, God, I created the Corinthian congregation, and what a wonderful congregation they are. Which is not the way it has been by the time that which is the reason for the letters, right? And then he basically says in 1:16 and following, I wanted for you to have a double gift or a double favor. I wanted to visit you on my way to Macedonia and then to come back. And so basically he wanted to visit them again. And then things change. Verse 17. Was I vacillating when I wanted to do that? Well, they had said yes. Do I make my plans according to the flesh, ready to say yes, yes, and no, no at the same time? As surely as God is faithful, our word to you, our logos to you, has not been yes and no, etc. And so basically, yeah, I did change my travel plans, and there were reasons for it. And therefore, it is God who establishes us with you in Christ and has anointed us. So basically, the reason I'm your apostle is because God made it that way. Okay, verse 22. Now, let me turn the page here. As we go on, Paul has said his conduct was blameless, and he defended his travel plans, and then he had to change his travel plans, okay? So now, verse 23 of chapter 1, but I call on God as witness against me, it was to spare you that I did not come again to Corinth. See, he's already made the second painful visit to Corinth, see? And he probably promised to come back again, see? It was to spare you that I did not come again to Corinth. I do not mean to imply that we lord it over your faith, although his opponents certainly think he does. Rather, we are workers with you for your joy because you stand firm in the faith. Anybody want to believe that one? That the Corinthians stand firm in the faith? Oh my God. Well, they stand firm in the faith if they have accepted Paul's correction in letter F. See? So then, chapter 2, verse 1. So I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit. See how he's talking about his pain in connection with their pain? See? Consolation. I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit. For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? And I wrote as I did, verse 3, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. The way he wrote is he's referring to the painful letter. He's referring to letter F. For I am confident about all of you that my joy would be the joy of you all. In other words, if I enjoyed my second visit, my third visit, you'd enjoy it too. Because the second visit was very unenjoyable, see? Now, verse 4, for I wrote you out of much distress and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. So he basically doesn't say, I wrote you a really tough letter and you certainly needed it. You ignorant Corinthians. He doesn't call them anoetoi like he called the Galatians, mindless. But you ignorant Corinthians, you really needed it. You needed to be corrected, and I did correct you, and it did you some good. Now, that's what my mother would have said to me, and my father would have said the same thing even more. But Paul rhetorically doesn't do that. Verse 5, but if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but to some extent, not to exaggerate it, to all of you. This punishment by the majority is enough for such a person. This is the person who was apparently, as far as we can guess, was the ringleader of the opposition against Paul. And the congregation has decided to punish that person. Okay? The punishment by the majority is enough for such a person. So now instead you should forgive and console him so that he may not be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Right? So I urge you to reaffirm your love for him, for I wrote this for this reason, to test you and to know whether you are obedient in everything. Paul is not buddy-buddy with him. A priest that I know, who I'm not sure I consider him a friend, but maybe at one time I did, he said about a certain bishop, you can be everybody's buddy or you can be everybody's bishop. But in any event, I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. I wrote you to know whether you are obedient in everything. And then verse 10, anyone whom you forgive, I also forgive. What I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, well, of course he has been for your sake in the presence of Christ. And we do this so that we may not be outwitted by Satan, for we are not ignorant of Satan's designs. And then we have the narration of Paul's anxiety in Troas, 2:12. When I came to Troas to proclaim the good news of Christ, a door was opened for me in the Lord. But my mind could not rest. Literally, there was no rest in my spirit because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said farewell to them and went on to Macedonia. Now, skip 2:14 through 7:4 and go directly to 7:5, and I believe you will see this same letter pick up again. Okay? Remember, he had no rest in his spirit because he went to Macedonia, and he was missing Titus, right? Now, verse 5 of chapter 7. And even when we came into Macedonia, there was no rest in our flesh. Note the parallelism of spirit versus flesh. There was no rest in our flesh, but we were afflicted in every way, disputes without and fears within. That's what it's like to minister in churches. Disputes without and fears within. But God, who consoles the downcast, consoled us by the arrival of Titus. See, that was the stuff he was talking about in 1:1 through 2:13, and is not talked about in 2:14 through 7:4. But it does pick up again in 7:5 and following. So that's why we piece 7:5 and splice it to the end of 2:13. See? So anyway, he goes on. I do not say this to condemn you, for I said this before. Well, wait a minute. Yes. 7:5. We came into Macedonia, and our bodies had no rest. There was no rest in our flesh. But we were afflicted in every way, disputes without and fears within. But God, who consoles the downcast, consoled us by the arrival of Titus, and not only by his coming, but also by the consolation with which he was consoled about you. As he told us, this was the response to the tough letter. He told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced still more. In other words, we have shared in our sufferings, in other words, the topic of consolation. And now Titus has told me that you guys repented. And the letter that caused me much anguish of heart and many tears, he told us of your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me. Your zeal for me. That means tossing out the super apostles, see? So that I rejoiced even more. For even if I made you sorry with my letter, what do you mean even if? For I do not regret it, though I did regret it. For I see that I grieved you with that letter, though only briefly. Yeah, I caused you pain. Now, my mother or father would have said, yeah, and you needed it. Now, I rejoice not because you were grieved, but because your grief led to repentance, for you felt a godly grief, so that you were not harmed in any way by us. You were grieved. I sent you a tough letter, but you were not harmed in any way by us. Us meaning Paul. For godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation and brings no regret, but worldly grief produces death. For see what earnestness, here is the reaction to the letter, verse 11 of chapter 7. See what earnestness this godly grief has produced in you, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation against the super apostles, see. What alarm, what longing, what zeal, what punishment. At every point, you have proved yourself guiltless in this matter. So although I wrote to you, it was not on account of the one who did the wrong, the one he's told them now to forgive, that one, right? It was not on account of the one who did the wrong, nor on the account of the one who was wronged, which is Paul, but in order that your zeal for us might be made known to you before God. In this we find comfort. And then he goes on, verse 13b, in addition to our own consolation, we rejoice still more at the joy of Titus, because his mind has been set at rest by you. In other words, he saw that the Corinthians turned around, see? For if I have been somewhat boastful about you to him, I was not disgraced. Just as everything we said to you was true, so our boasting to Titus has proved true as well. In other words, he's been boasting about the Corinthians to Titus, even though the Corinthian church, of course, threw Paul out, right? But now they've turned around, and Titus is relieved. And so when Titus told Paul about the Corinthians, Paul was relieved. His heart, verse 15, goes out all the more to you as he remembers the obedience of all of you, and how you welcomed him with fear and trembling. That's after the severe letter, right? You welcomed here with fear and trembling. I rejoice because I have complete confidence in you. So Paul wrote the letter that he refers to as the letter that caused him pain. It caused the Corinthians pain, and when Titus actually got there, the people who were there treated Titus with fear and trembling. How about that? I wish I could write letters like that. Anyway, and you can see in verses 13b through 16, you have both the conquestio, and conquestio means you're going after, you're trying to acquire the goodwill and the emotions of the audience in favor of your case. That's what conquestio is. And then the other thing is you're trying to recapitulate the argument of the letter. And the recapitulation includes the present favorable status of the Corinthians, of Titus, and of Paul. Okay? There's a couple of things. Reconciliation is necessary in congregations that are in conflict. We know from my line of work, my other line of work, is that you can have a perfectly good priest and it can be perfectly loggerheads with a parish. And the priest can have done nothing wrong at all, but they didn't hit it off. And so there's conflict, and so when that is the case, they either will work it out or the priest will leave. And when that happens, there'll be a lot of bad feelings on both sides. That's the problem with congregations. Paul wanted to believe the best about the Corinthians, and anyway, that's the fun of ministering in church. Paul is very clear about the fact that when there is when you have a bad congregation or a deeply opinionated congregation, and they're on the wrong track, no real reconciliation is going to be possible without the correction of the Corinthians. No reconciliation between the factions in the Corinthian church that we know about from 1 Corinthians 1:10, and no reconciliation between the majority of the Corinthians and Paul was ever going to be possible without the correction of the Corinthians by Paul. And it was definitely not merely a clash of personalities. There are some people who deal with Paul and say, well, he was angry. Paul was angry. Well, first of all, how do you know what Paul's emotions were? Were you there, you know? The other side is my grandfather, Bayard Witt, in Texarkana, who was a railroad man, and he became a really great architect. He once said to my uncles, according to my mother, boys, this is not a democracy. And would Paul have agreed with that blunt declaration of how a family or a church would work? In my opinion, Paul would have agreed with that. This ain't no democracy. On the other hand, when you read Paul's letter to the Corinthians, many letters, Paul made effort after effort to shift the discussion away from himself to, okay, what is Christ about? What is God about? And what are the relations of the Corinthian Christians to Christ and to each other? You know, this stuff that you're doing, you know, when he wrote letter C, he was responding to their letter in which they said they were spiritual and that they were filled and that they were kings. They were full of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And he responded to that and saying, you know, if I have all of these wonderful spiritual gifts, including speaking in tongues and all manner of other things, if I have all wisdom and knowledge, but I don't have love, it's like nothing at all. If I speak in tongues and do all kinds of things, I'm like a clanging cymbal. I'm a noisemaker. So Paul was able in 1 Corinthians 13 to say, okay, here is what love is like. And what love is like is exactly the opposite of how the Corinthians have been acting. And that's what 1 Corinthians 13 is really about. It's not really about love. It's about changing your behavior. Okay. And finally, reluctantly I think, Paul did have to get down and dirty with the Corinthians in letter F. And that's the letter that he had the temerity to refer to as the letter that I wrote out of much anguish of heart and with many tears. And if 2 Corinthians 10 through 13 is not that letter, then that very severe letter is lost. Now we move on to Corinthian letter H. And the Corinthian letter H, which is only a fragment of a letter, is 2 Corinthians 9. In our reconstruction, Corinthian letter H is the final letter of the series. It's the 8th letter out of 8 that we have, and it consists of the whole of 2 Corinthians 9. Probably it was put into this pastiche called 2 Corinthians by the editor, and he put it right next to 2 Corinthians 8. Not many scholars believe that it's really the same letter as 2 Corinthians 8. At the Jerusalem conference that is recounted in Galatians 2, 1 through 10, and also is mentioned prominently in Acts chapter 15, particularly in Galatians, Paul says that he was not called on the carpet to go explain himself and Gentile Christianity at the Jerusalem conference. He was not called on the carpet by superiors because Paul understands that he has no earthly superiors. And he opens the letter to the Galatians by saying, Paul, an apostle, not from man or through man, but by a revelation of Jesus Christ. Right? And then after, when Christ was pleased to reveal his Son to me or in me, I did not confer with flesh and blood. In other words, Paul gets his wisdom about the Christian life and about the Christian faith directly from God. He doesn't get it from other fellow Christians, except a little bit of it. that he mentions in 1 Corinthians 15. Of course, in Galatians, we know that the Jerusalem conference the cause of it was the circumcision controversy. And the circumcision controversy that was such a big deal in the Galatian letter, we don't see it anywhere else except in Galatians. And we do see perhaps traces of it in Romans, but only traces. And so in the Corinthian letters and in 1 Thessalonians, the circumcision controversy is no more. But at the Jerusalem conference, he laid before the apostles, the so-called pillars, the way he does the Christian faith. And he says in verse 6 of chapter 2 of Galatians, "These leaders added nothing to me. They did not tell me I had to do anything else. They added nothing to me. Except, in 2:10, they asked only one thing. They added nothing to me in terms of something that I had to do for the Gentiles to be valid Christians, right, without circumcision. They added nothing to me, but they asked only one thing, that we remember the poor. And that thing was actually what I was eager to do. It was already my idea, practically." And remembering the poor is the phrase for the Jerusalem conference, asking Paul and the Gentile Christians who have money jingling in their pockets to raise money for the relief of Jerusalem Christians who are being persecuted. Okay? And Paul agreed to it at the Jerusalem conference. Who were the poor? Well, there was a group of people called the Evyonim. Evyon means poor, and there were Evyonim, which may be a particular group of Christians who were Jews who became believers in Jesus. There's also a gospel of the Ebionites, which may be related to the Evyonim. But the Evyonim means poor people, poor pious Jews who were followers of Christ. And so, to remember the poor meant to take up a collection of money to relieve these fellow Christians during the famine, and also if there was persecution, which in fact there was. And Paul sees this as a way of stopping the fighting between Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians, which is evidently the meaning of the circumcision controversy that caused Paul to need to write the letter to the Galatians. See, the Jewish Christians saying the Gentiles are not really Christians because they don't keep the Torah of Moses, right? But if Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, the headquarters of Judaism, if they were to accept the gift from the Gentile Christians of Paul's churches, this would mean that the Jewish Christians would, in effect, be accepting these Gentile Christians as equal partners in the gospel. In other words, love my money, love me. There must be a nicer way of putting it. And so Paul was eager to get his almost totally Gentile churches, or totally Gentile churches, maybe, to take up collections which would be given to fellow Christians in Jerusalem. During the conflict between Paul and the Corinthians, giving to the collection that Paul was taking up had stopped. What a surprise. Now that, as Paul thought, after the letter of reconciliation, after things had settled down and things were going well, Paul is writing them, the Corinthians, to kindly resume your giving, right? And so what we have in chapter 9 of 2 Corinthians, we don't have an exordium, we don't have a thanksgiving prayer, we don't have anything other than a two-part proof, or a one-part proof with two arguments. And we don't have anything else. Let's read that for a moment. 2 Corinthians 9. "Now it is not necessary for me to write you about the ministry to the saints." Well, of course he is writing them. "For I know your eagerness, which is the subject of my boasting about you to the people of Macedonia, saying that Achaia, not Corinth, but the province of Achaia, has been ready since last year, And your zeal at raising the money has stirred up most of them. But I am sending the brothers in order that our boasting about you may not prove to have been empty in this case, so that you may be ready as I said you would be. In other words, he's already told the others that the Achaeans are going to be ready with the money. See? You will be ready as I said you would be. Otherwise, verse 4, if some Macedonians come with me and find that you are not ready, we would be humiliated, to say nothing of you in this undertaking. Ooh, the Macedonians are kind of proverbially poor, see, and they've been giving faithfully. The Corinthians are proverbially not poor, and they're the people that have been withholding the funds, see. So if you are not ready to give us the money for the relief of the Jerusalem Christians, we would be humiliated. And just think how humiliated you would be. How about that? Verse 5, so I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go ahead to you, and arrange in advance for this bountiful gift that you have promised, so that it may be ready as a voluntary gift and not as an extortion. Verse 6, the point is this: the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Verse 7, each of you must give as you have made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in every good work. As it is written, he scatters abroad, he gives to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Verse 10, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will become more righteous. Verse 11, you will be enriched in every way. Remember, the Corinthians wrote the letter that said we have been enriched. We are filled, we are rich, we are kings. 4:8, 1 Corinthians. And Paul, in the Thanksgiving prayer, 1 Corinthians says, I thank my God that you have been enriched in every way. See, they've been boasting about their spiritual gifts. And now, Paul is talking about not spiritual gifts so much as he is talking about money. Verse 11, you will be enriched in every way for your great generosity, which will produce thanksgiving to God through us. For the rendering of this ministry not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also overflows with many thanksgivings to God. In other words, you'll supply their needs, and they will say prayers of thanksgiving to God for you. Through the testing of the ministry, you glorify God by your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ, and by the generosity of your sharing with them and with all others. Verse 14, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God that he has given you, thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. And that's all that we have of letter H.
Can I ask you, is he in a way trying to shame them into giving?
Yes. Yes. He did it in 2 Corinthians 8 as well. You know, the poor Macedonians who don't have nothing. I will not use the phrase that my father would have used about the Macedonians, about a particular pot they didn't have. They begged us insistently to be able to give. So the Macedonians, who are proverbially poor, have been begging insistently to be able to give to this. So what should you, perhaps nouveau riche, very well-to-do Corinthians, in the trade center of that part of Greece, what should you do? And as if that were not enough, that was the exemplum of the Macedonians in 2 Corinthians 8, and right after that is the exemplum of Christ. Christ, even though he was rich, he gave up everything and became poor for your sake. So Paul is using the topics of honor and advantage. He tells them both in 2 Corinthians 8 and 2 Corinthians 9, it's to your advantage to give. and it's the honorable thing for you to give. That's exactly what you do in deliberative rhetoric. See? So the two main topics are honor, do the honorable thing, and then do the advantageous thing. And the advantageous thing is, if you give, then you will help the other Christians, and these Christians will overflow with prayers of thanksgiving for you. They will pray for you. In 2 Corinthians 8, he says, you have money, your needs are met now. If you meet their needs, someday when you're poor, they'll meet your needs. So that's the topic of advantage. If you give, here is how it will advantage you. And of course, you couple the topic of advantage with the topic of honor. You've got the two classic topics of deliberative rhetoric. And that's way older than Aristotle. That goes back to the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. That goes back before rhetorical handbooks. Okay? Well, anyway, you've heard my consistently rhetorical critical analysis of these letters, and you haven't heard the other side of it from other scholars, but anyway, here are the questions that this analysis raises for me, and we're still good on time. How would you feel if Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, letter F, the severe letter, were actually written to your congregation? If the Corinthian, 10 through 13 of 2 Corinthians was written to your congregation, would you be willing to accept Paul's leadership as your apostle? Or would you want to throw him out? Okay. Next question. After reading Corinthian letters A through H, or by reading 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians in the usual form in the New Testament, do you come away with a hopeful attitude toward a church's possibility of really being a truly Christian community? Is it really possible to be a healthy, appropriate, loving, ministering Christian community? Gosh, I hope so. And is there any part of the Corinthian letters that give you more hope than other parts? Is there any part of the Corinthian correspondence that offends you more than other parts? A lot of people are offended by 10 through 13. And then two final questions about Paul. After having read the Corinthian letters of Paul in detail, do you come away from these texts with a more favorable or a more unfavorable view of Paul? And it may be that you have a mixed view of Paul. A lot of my colleagues in theology have a very mixed view of Paul, and some have a negative view of Paul. I don't agree with them, but anyway. And then the big question that I put in bold, do you think that the Apostle Paul was a valid spiritual guide for the Corinthians? Is Paul's spiritual advice that he gave to the Corinthians by letter, is it still valid for us as Christians today? Why or why not? So the floor is open. Those are my questions. You may have other questions.
Well, I don't know if I don't know if my opinion of Paul was made better by, or if he was pretty direct in his letters, but then I guess sometimes you have to be direct to get people's attention. I don't know.
I would say he was very direct.
And I don't know. I think this is probably pretty valid. And I think no matter what, down through the years, there's some things that don't change, and you have to get money to keep on going. So sometimes you have to get people's attention. So you have to be direct. I don't know. That's
and you may very well have to get them to quit fighting each other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And fighting the local leadership. Yeah. Well, that's my opinion too. So that's you can see that the lines of work that I'm in are very interesting lines of work. Interesting in the sense of the Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. But anyway, I think that's the fun. That's the encouraging part and the discouraging part of being in ordained ministry and working in congregations. But if you don't work in a congregation and you work somewhere else, like you teach in a seminary or whatever, you will find bits and pieces of encouragement, and you'll find bits and pieces, perhaps large bits and pieces, of discouragement.
Well, I just think that as long as you have people coming together, there's going to be some things that are true thousands of, hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, and there's some things that are still true today, because people are people. People haven't changed that much, really.
I don't think they've changed at all, really.
So,
It's like one of my teachers, Professor Hans-Dieter Betz, and I studied with him for a couple of years before I went back to Evanston to study with Bob Jewett. And he said, Paul is very contemporary.
Paul is very what?
Contemporary. Paul is very contemporary. And I think I can assure you in the strongest possible terms that if you study the Corinthian letters or other letters of Paul and you really put them in the context of these congregational and connectional problems within congregations and between congregations and with clergy, etc., when you put them in the context of what is going on in actual congregations and groups of congregations, I don't find any problem with the whole issue of the relevance of Paul. There's not the slightest problem. Paul is very contemporary. And I think that's why I'm a Pauline scholar, is because I like the directness of Paul, and I like the directness of the fact that in the Pauline letters, mostly, we are reading actual letters written to actual congregations. And that's what I really love about the Pauline corpus, is that for the most part, for the majority of the letters, we're talking about real letters that Paul wrote to real congregations for real reasons.
Yeah, sure.
To me, that's much more attractive than anything else in the New Testament.
Well,
But I can only speak for myself.
Well, I do think his spiritual advice is valid for today, and it will probably be valid many years in the future.
Gosh, I hope so.
I mean, that's just something that I believe that his advice is valid. He was very direct. He got people's attention.
I think that's putting it mildly. Yeah, and if you accept our partition theory, he wasn't that direct until letter F. He kept trying to do it not quote unquote direct.
Mm-hmm.
He tried to he hoped and believed the best of the Corinthian church until it was impossible for him to believe the best anymore. And that's when he made the second visit. The second visit was a disaster, and that's when he wrote letter F. And if you read in chapter 2 and 5 of 2 Corinthians, it got a hell of a reaction.
Sure.
So I think that our partition theory is as good as any and better than most. And I think that people should read it according to our partition theory, and then also read it according to the canonical way, and see what really makes sense. This partition theory makes sense to us, and something like it has made sense to a number of our colleagues. Well, that is the end of our Corinthian letters. I can mention that if you want to know more, read the book, The Corinthian Correspondence. Yes, Redaction, Rhetoric, and History, published by Lexington Books in October of 2021. And I'm not really working on Corinthians at the present moment. I'm now working on Mark. But anyway, starting next Sunday, we will have our same time, same place, and we'll work through Amos, God and Justice. And then here is the schedule. We will take Palm Sunday and Easter off.